since I am the only one daring to use the video, I will turn it off. All right, trustees, ladies and gentlemen, it's 6:30, and I'm going to call this meeting to order of July 8th, 2020. And Director, I would ask you to take roll call, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, through you. Before we begin, Mr. Chair, I'm just thinking we should just confirm that we're in the right link here. We have two links. One is for the staff and trustees to be on the team event, which allows the participants from the board and the staff to have and engage the microphone. And the live event, as you know, Mr. Chair, doesn't have that option. So I'm just wanting to make sure with Ms. Workman that we're all in the right spot here before we go with our roll call.
Stephen. There are two links that have been sent. I'm not sure what happened with the live event invitation, but I believe the trustees are coming online now into the right meeting. Larry is on the phone and not within the meeting itself, which is okay.
Okay, thank you very much. So, Mr. Chair, thank you for the cue. This is our roll call for our trustees and the Board of Education for the 8th of July, 2020 for our special meeting. Trustee Barry. Trustee Cram. Trustee Danaher. Trustee Jacobs.
Present.
Thank you. Vice Chair McPherson.
Present.
Thank you. Chair McAllister.
Present.
Thank you. Trustee McRae. Trustee McDonald. Trustee Parisian.
Present.
Thank you.
Trustee Danaher is here too. I'm sorry, Director. I was on the wrong link.
Thank you. Noted. Trustee Schooler. Trustee Swan. Mr. Chair, you do not have quorum at this moment. I count 5 trustees on the line at this time.
Director, it's Trustee Cram. I'm now on the line.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, you do have quorum at this point. You have 6 trustees reporting in.
Is there anyone else who was trying to get in that couldn't?
Yeah, Chair, there's Trustee McRae has messaged. He says he has no internet, but he wasn't able to speak up whenever the roll.
Just to add in here, John McRae is online. There's a few other people that are online, but it looks like they are on the other link. But I can see them that they are online.
Yes, I'm McRae here. Sorry for all this. It seems to be working now, but it wasn't before.
Derek, could you contact Trustee Barry? Is he on the right link?
He was. I'm not quite sure where he went. There is only one phone number up. I'm not sure who it is. It's 407-3840.
That's
All right.
Superintendent Ferguson.
Okay, thank you.
I'm
Mr.
wondering,
Chair, would
Derek,
you,
go ahead.
Mr. Chair, it's Steve here. I'm wondering if you would like me to do roll call one more time just for confirmation who's online with us at this point.
Yes, that's a good idea. Thank you. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good evening, trustees. This is our roll call for the 8th of July, 2020 for our special meeting. Trustee Barry. Trustee Cram.
Present.
Thank you. Trustee Danaher.
Present.
Thank you. Trustee Jacobs.
Present.
Thank you. Vice Chair.
I hope I'm still here. Present.
Mr. Thank you. Chair McAllister.
I am present.
Thank you. Trustee McCray.
Present, I believe.
Thank you. Trustee McDonald. Trustee Parisian.
Present.
Thank you. Trustee Schooler. Trustee Swan. Student Trustee Colton Kelford. Mr. Chair, you have quorum with 7 of your trustees at the table.
Thank you very much.
Director Sliwa, Trustee Schooler will be joining momentarily. He had a little issue with his internet. Just one moment.
Thank
Please
you.
proceed.
Lisa, would you mind checking on Trustee Barry?
Yes, I would be happy to do that.
Thank you very much. I'm going to move to item 401, which is the approval of the agenda. I have a motion moved by Trustee Cram, seconded by Trustee Schooler, that the Upper Canada District School Board approve the special board meeting agenda of July 8th, 2020. Would you cast your ballots, please? I'm voting in favor. I'm not in yet.
Not up on my screen, I'm in favor.
It's not up on my screen. I'm in favor.
I'm in favor.
It should be
Danaher in
populating
favor, it's
shortly.
not up on my screen.
Jacobs in favor.
It just popped up, guys.
Mr. Chair, it's Stephen here, just to let you know, you have a count of 6 out of 7, and so that motion would carry.
Thank you very much. Excuse me, I'm just jumping here from. Okay. Item 501. Are there any conflict of interest declarations? Hearing none, I'm going to move to item 601, which is the proposed revisions to the 2020-2021 school year calendar submission for the USB. And I will turn this over to Superintendent McNair.
Good evening, everyone. Through you, Chair, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, great. Thank you. So tonight I wanted to bring forward to you For your review and consideration are recommendations for revisions to our UCDSB proposed 2020-2021 school year calendar. In the report you would have received, the board report for tonight's meeting, you will recall that after extensive consultation with numerous stakeholders back at March 25th, 2020, there was an approval from the Board of Trustees for the school year calendar of the 2020-2021 that we put forward at that time. And that would be attachment A that is in your package. And then on April 28th, school boards were informed that their school year calendar submissions were not being considered from the ministry at that time due to the uncertainty around the reopening of schools for September. And subsequently, a memo came from the Minister of Education on June 30th that advised us in order to maximize instruction time for students, school boards and school authorities were encouraged to start their school year by September 1st. It was also advised that boards schedule 3 PA days prior to the start of the student instruction. These are consultations. There are consultations currently underway with various stakeholders regarding the PA days and what training may be required as part of our reopening strategy. So you will see also back in March 25th, the 7 proposed PA days that were approved at the board table. What we are bringing forward to you tonight is a recommendation to move 2 of the PA days. So we would first recommend moving the October 30th PA day, as well as the April 30th, 2021 PA day, so that our school year could start with 3 professional activity days, September 1st, September 2nd, and September 3rd on document B, which is in front of you. In order to ensure that we have an alignment in terms of the number of instructional days as set out from the Ministry of Education, we need 194 instructional days in a school year, 97 days in each semester. This would require us to move our January 29th original scheduled PA day to February 1st, 2021. This would ensure that we have the 3 professional development days directed by the ministry. We want to also rest assured that we will adhere to collective agreements and any of the considerations that need to be taken into play around professional development activities. We also want to let you know that we have been in consultation with some of our stakeholders, most recently as of last week with our union partners, and we have worked collaboratively with the Catholic District School Board of Eastern Ontario to ensure alignment of our PA days and our calendar so that no additional transportation costs are incurred for the Upper Canada District School Board. A few other highlights for you at this time. 9 English boards in Eastern Ontario are also looking to have 3 days of preparation in advance of the official opening of the school year to students as recommended in the ministry memo. Locally, as you know, we've had people away from our school settings for about 5 months by the time we conclude our summer and begin the next school year. So it will be really important for our staff to have this time to rehearse and practice, organize what our school days will look like, and to ensure that our adaptive model is adhered to by the Ministry of Education, whether it be in September in an adaptive role or a full reopening. So we would want certainly that time to support our staff. Distance learning continues to be new for many of us, as you know, and we now will have new teachers, we will have new students, and we will have some new circumstances for many as they transition back into school in September 2020. We are in the process of digitizing and organizing a consistent use of platforms throughout UCDSB, which will support student learning. And lastly, the Catholic Board of Eastern Ontario approved last night their school year calendar, which is coordinated with our UCDSB calendar. And this allows, again, for the efficiency and also supports our families and other who have students within both systems. So as you would see in front of you a few moments ago and in your package is the proposed calendar for this for the 2020-2021 school year, Chair. And so I would turn it over to you at this time to see if yourself or any members of the Board of Trustees would have any questions. And then we would ask you to consider the recommendation that has been placed in your package.
Thank you very much, Superintendent McNair. I was remiss at the beginning of this that I did not read the motion. So it's moved by Trustee Jacobs, seconded by Trustee McPherson, that the Upper Canada District School Board accept the revisions to its draft 2020-2021 school year calendar as per the report to the board on July 8th, 2020. Upon approval by the Board of Trustees, the calendar will be submitted to the Ministry of Education by July 10, 2020 for final approval. I open the floor for discussion. Hearing none, would you?
Chair, I do have a question.
Yes, go ahead.
My apologies, I have not, the hand up has disappeared off of the bar, so I was trying to do it that way, but it might help if people were able to go onto the chat line and type in whether they had a question or not. My question is regarding September 4. If we have a PA day the first 3 days, or PA days the first 3 days, and we have 1 day in that particular first week, assuming we don't have all students in class on the Friday and we have to split them in some ways, how is that going to affect the beginning of the school year? I'm hoping everybody's in school full time on that particular day, but assuming we're not, does it affect the slowdown of actually instructional days? Because I'm assuming September 4th will get used to the new setup, and therefore we have to do it again on Monday, or have we got plans to do it all on the Friday?
I will turn this over to Superintendent McNair.
Through you, Chair. Thank you, Trustee Cram. So as part of our draft reopening plan, we will be, upon approval, if the calendar is approved this year or this evening for next school year, we will continue to work as a senior admin staff and our working teams to coordinate what that Friday would look like. It would be the first day of school for our students. Again, as you alluded to, depending on potentially what if we have a cohort model or what direction comes from the ministry or from public health, but we would certainly be open for students to join us on that day being the first day of school. I would anticipate whether it's that day, the first day of school, or potentially, you know, a different day that week or the following week, we will certainly be spending a great deal of time working closely with our students to share with them certainly health and hygiene practices that we would want all of our students and staff to be adhering to while we're in the school.
Thank you. Does that answer your question, Trustee Cram?
As best as she could, Chair, knowing that it's going to be a different opening. So I'm appreciative of what Superintendent McNair said. It will be certainly different whether there's some people have to be online as well on the Friday or not in order to see the new setups in the classrooms. So, so I understand that we can't get a definitive answer yet, but it was just a question they did have about the Friday. So yes, it was answered as far as she can.
Are there any questions or comments? Seeing none, I'm going to ask you to cast your vote, and I'm having difficulty moving from board docs to Teams. But anyway, go ahead. Here I am. Please cast your vote.
Chair
John
McAllister, that
McCray,
motion
I'm in
does carry.
favor.
I
McAllister, that
gather
motion
from
carries.
this. Okay,
Yeah.
that motion is carried. So I'm now going to move to Article 602. This is a motion by Trustee McCray, and I'm not going to read it. It's moved by Trustee McCray, and I'm looking for a seconder. If there's a seconder, then I will read it, and we will proceed from there. Is there a seconder for this motion?
Chair, I'll second it to get it on the floor because I think anybody who puts a motion forward deserves to at least have it discussed. Whether I agree with it or not, we'll get to it after the discussion. But I think Trustee McCray at least deserves a chance to put forward his motion.
Thank you, Trustee.
All right,
Fran.
that's fine. The motion is on the floor, and as mover of the motion, Trustee McCray, I would ask you to speak to it.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's self-evident, I think, that we have to provide safe places for our students, 15 or less. It seems evident to me, anyway, that we have the parents have paid for transportation and for housing for the last 2 or 3 months that they didn't receive, so they have something coming back to them, it would seem. I would like to think that if we could involve our parent committee, the parent councils, and the principals, that we would get better input in this uncertain situation. This is unprecedented. We're not going to, I've never seen the like of it. Maybe some of you have, but I haven't. And I think that we would benefit from having our parent councils involved in the decision making. They don't, with a credit really is just saying that they have some input. They don't sign the checks. The money is not in their account. It's just a matter of them having some input on what we do starting in the fall. There's a lot of question with parents on whether their children are going to be accommodated, and it impacts single moms, it impacts single fathers, it impacts everybody who has to go to work, and maybe some would say that we are only in the business of education, but it would seem that we're also in the business of looking after children. And I think it's important that the parents' councils and the principals of each individual schools be given the opportunity to give input into the decisions on what their schools are going to look like in September. And given that they were taxed for this $6 million surplus, that the only reason we have it is because they have paid it, and the pandemic came along, so they weren't paid out. I would like to see it go to the 80,000 per school, go out to them, and they give it back. It probably won't mean that there's going to be anything revolutionary, but there may be some very good ideas come forward on how we open their schools. Whether I think that the collaboration point. Collaboration means, I think, that we enter into agreements with the health unit to perhaps help deliver, perhaps share space, perhaps share the cost of delivering a safe school. I don't feel that we're out of the woods on this yet by a long shot. And what if schools open? Hopefully they will. I want to ensure that we have the best, safest, most sustainable school systems we have. And that means that I think that we need to have each individual schools contributing. You can read what it says about being resolved. The August Academy, to me, I want to hear what the students have to say. I think that if we can get into kind of, for want of a better term, a kind of a war footing, so we hit the road and start making this happen by middle of August, then a couple weeks of a best practices academy in our schools will have not only the teachers, but the students and everybody, and particularly the select students, who can come in and be leaders in how we deliver in very uncertain terms and uncertain times. I guess that's it, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. I would take further questions.
I do have one, Chair.
Go ahead, Trustee McCram.
Thank you, Chair. Trustee McRae, if I understand right, when you're looking at the 80K per school, and we have 72 schools, that we're looking at the money from the surplus that we may have at the end of the year to be distributed completely to all of the schools? Is that what I'm understanding you're saying?
What I understood is that we have this 6.6 million now. That is a direct result of not having to have occurred the expenses of transportation and school cleaning, et cetera, that goes with the operation of the schools. My understanding is that's money that's sitting in a fund right now. And I thought it was 79 schools, so I'm not sure, Don.
Okay, supplemental, Chair.
Go ahead, Trustee Cram.
Trustee McRae, what happens in September when we spend all of the money to the distributed to each of the different schools, and we have unforeseen circumstances that come up in September, and we don't have the money to do that yet? We really don't know how our opening is occurring. We don't know what kind of expenses were going to occur, if anything, until after we have our budget discussion. So it might be a little premature to be looking at sending the money out to each of the individual schools. I mean, that is a choice that trustees have, but I'm concerned that we won't have the money in September to do anything differently. So I'm just putting that out, looking at a reaction that you may have, what you may consider is bringing it back later. As a possibility if there's any unspent money in September. I just have a major concern about the upstart in September. So I'm just looking for a reaction from you over that.
Fair enough, Trustee Cram. I view the 80K as a credit. It would not be in the hands of the individual schools. It would remain with the signing authority at the board. However, it is an acknowledgement that the parents paid the money in and they did not receive the benefit. It was like as if you went and paid for a service, only that service wasn't delivered. So what it does is, if you prioritize, what I am doing, and I think most of us do, prioritize our schools being safe. Probably most of us have, and all of us, I think, have record paper, and we're a long way, I think, from having our schools prepared to be declared safe. And it's all relative. But to me, if we don't start tomorrow making those schools safe, whether it's installing ventilation systems or whether it's just putting in stations, whether it's having protocols in place so that discrete location in the grounds are separated from the others, I think that we should not wait until September to put monies forth. Whether this 80K per school is enough, hard to say. But to me, the schools have some claim to that because they did not receive the benefit for which they paid.
Last part of my diatribe, Chair. Just so Trustee McRae knows, I will be voting against it because I do think it's premature. If we happen to have money left over after we open up in September, that might be a different story to consider back then. So I would encourage him to possibly delay his motion until after we see where we're going to be in our budget deliberations. But as it stands now, I'm just concerned about how we open up in September and would rather wait and see what happens then. But I think he deserved the right to put his motion on the floor.
And much appreciated. I appreciate that, Don, and it's fully within your prerogative to vote as you choose, regardless of whether you second a motion. So fair.
Are there any further discussions on this motion?
Mr. Chair, I'd like to comment, please.
Trustee McDonald?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I just need to clarify. At the outset, I will be voting against this, but I need to clarify some points here. The $6.6 million surplus is not paid by parents. It's paid by all ratepayers within our board jurisdiction. There is not a fee for service for you to send your child to school or a fee for service for transportation. There is not, I think it needs to be a clarification that it isn't money to be rebated back to individuals because they didn't get the right for something. That's the way we collect our funds. That's the way the funds flow from the government and the municipalities through our GSNs. It isn't going directly or coming directly from the parents to us. It isn't going back directly to the parents. And if anything, the money may get returned to the ministry at some point. We've had surpluses in the past where the ministry has said you have to use this surplus before we give you additional funds. I think this is a little too late to even consider. I think most of the comments that I've heard really didn't talk to the motion. The motion talks about having an academy and having some things done throughout the course of the summer, or really money to be spent throughout the course of the summer. That planning process should have been done months ago for that. And I think it would be nice if we had funds allocated for those purposes, that we could retrofit schools. But we also get funds for specific purposes that we cannot then move into other areas. There are a lot of implications here. It's not just as simple as saying I've got leftover money, let's go out and spend it on a bunch of things. That doesn't work that way. And for us to wait till September, that's too late because our year end ends on August 31st. I think our position tonight needs to be that we continue to talk about our budget, pass a budget that looks like we are going to be compliant, and then be very specific on how we allocate those funds come September. I think we need to have continued guidance from the ministry on how and what reopening schools look like, and to sit here and start to allocate $80,000 as a fresh Band-Aid approach across all schools really doesn't make sense either. I think we need to make sure that we're being good stewards of the money, and just simply saying we've got extra money and putting it back into places doesn't make us good stewards of money, or good stewards of the finances of the Upper Canada District School Board. So I won't be supporting this. I need to make sure that we clarify that this is not a fee for service situation, and parents did not directly pay and not receive something, so they're owed that rebate. That's not completely how it works, and I think we need to continue to talk about our budget and move on from that point.
Thank you, Trustee McDonald, for the clarification. And I just want to point out that the premise of this motion is that there is something like $600,000 or more to be distributed among schools. That is not the case, because according to the budget, which we're going to see very shortly, I hope, our projected surplus is somewhere in the order of 200,000. So anyway, any further comments?
Yes, Mr. Chair. I'd like to say that from my understanding, they paid for a service and they've not received it. And the question of collaboration with the health unit, is there no discussion about that? Is there no consideration? The academy is a way of bringing in best practices. We're not, it's a credit. We're talking about involving the parents and council and the principals of the individual schools to have input into these safe schools. It's just a little more, another level of due diligence. But that's it. I'm good to go.
The assumption is that that is not happening, and I disagree with that. Are you willing to conclude by speaking to the final, as a final speaker to the motion?
Yes, sir.
Go ahead.
I'm finished. I'm finished, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. At this point, I will now call the vote.
Mr. Chair, that motion is defeated.
Thank you, Lisa. We are going to move to 603, which is the initial revenue projections and grants for student needs and highlights. And I will turn this over to Superintendent Hobbs and his staff.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's a pleasure to bring back to you the next chapter in our ongoing discussion of the budget for fiscal year 2020-2021. I think I actually almost said 1920 there, so I don't know what that means about my status right now, but we are definitely talking about the upcoming fiscal year 2020-21. So I can see that I believe you can see the slides on your page right now. So I'm just going to advance us to slide number 2. And to talk to you tonight, really what we'd like to do is talk to you about the GSNs, or the Grants for Student Needs, and the education funding that was announced on June 19th of this year. So as you'll recall, finance staff presented trustees a preliminary outlook for the 2020-21 budget on April 22nd, 2020. The preliminary outlook for the upcoming year estimated a $0.7 million or $700,000 operating surplus at year end. And that was based on an awful lot of assumptions. As you'll recall, at that time, we had very little information about the upcoming fiscal year and what the government's intentions were. The COVID-19 pandemic was still at a relatively early stage in terms of its evolution, and continues to evolve to this day, in fact. And of course, we are dealing with some early assumptions about what we would be required to do with respect to our program and policy for the coming year. Finance staff then came back and presented a preliminary expense budget on May 27th, 2020, estimating at approximately $375 million. And again, that sort of summary of our expenses, or what we saw as our expenses, was really based on commitments we knew we would likely have to make under the collective agreement, and in fact, commitments that were already in play per some of the staffing timelines in our collective agreements, but without any visibility into, again, what the funding was going to be. And so in order for us to present you a budget, we obviously need to know what the funding is, we need to know what the expenses are, and those two things come together to present a budget, a complete budget. And tonight, what we're going to do is not present you a complete budget, but to continue the evolution of our story. We've already spoken about the expense side of things, and now with visibility into the grants for student needs announced by the Ministry of Education, we can give you an overview of what we see the funding being. I'd like to emphasize for you that these represent our initial revenue projections. Staff are working really, really hard to get the details down to form that full budget, but work is ongoing daily and nightly and through the weekend, so that we'll be in a position next week on Wednesday the 15th to present you a full-blown budget with the details of both the funding and the expense side. But tonight, really, the focus is on the high-level impact of the GSNs on the Upper Canada District School Board. So moving on to the next slide. Just to reinforce, I think this is a slide that we brought to you either in May or in April, but when we're actually building the budget, there are some things that are front of mind for us. As you know, we're probably about a month later than even normal. We prefer to be having these conversations in May, but recognizing the fact that we're even a month later than we were last year, now into mid-July with passing a budget. Many of the commitments that we've already had to make, per the collective agreement, staffing up for the upcoming school year, many of those commitments have already been made because we're following the timelines in the collective agreement, and because we really are in the throes of trying to figure out what the school year is going to look like and put those resources in place so that we're ready to go in September. But that being said, really what we'd like to do with this process is provide trustees comfort that they're able to exercise their oversight and decision-making roles through the budget process without feeling artificially rushed. Secondly, we'd like to ensure the approved budget is compliant with ministry requirements, contractual other obligations, and other requirements. Thirdly, we'd like to provide a strategy to address stated board priorities. And through the trustee priority setting process back in the winter, we talked about things like growing the accumulated surplus, expanding the Power Up program, investing in elementary well-being specialists, and as recently as our last meeting, talking about a contingency designed to address evolving transportation needs. So we want to have a mechanism of actually addressing those priorities. However, in addition, in light of the ongoing pandemic, we'd also like to provide a strategy to allow the board to pivot resources to effectively respond to the actual operating conditions in September 2020 and beyond. And as you know, the government recently provided 3 major strategies or approaches for us to address the school opening in September. One of them was fully open, one of them was really fully closed or status quo, and in the middle there's something in the middle. And as recently as today, you know, that kind of imperative is continuing to evolve, and the direction we're hearing from the government is continuing to evolve. So the previous agenda item conversation, quite apropos, because we still really are, it's a moving target to determine what we're going to be dealing with in September, and it's really a moving target, I think, what we're going to be dealing with in October or November or so on next year. And we'd really like to be able to, through the budget process, provide trustees a mechanism to address needs as they evolve, even if it represents a modest financial strategy. So moving on to the next slide. This is slide 4. So as we started to inform by the GSN release, as we started to shape up the revenue projections in greater detail for next year, the references and analysis that we put together are based on the Ministry of Education's June 19th release of the GSN funding memorandum. We also have the 2020-21 technical paper, which really does a bit deeper dive in terms of the nature of the funding and how that funding is generated. And then, of course, the financial reporting templates, or the EFIS forms, which you may have heard of, which really represents the detailed tools by which we generate the specific numbers with regard to revenue. The GSN funding estimates that we are presented are based on and include the enrollment projections we received from the Planning Department on April 16th, 2020. So as you know, a vast majority, or a good chunk of our funding is based on enrollment, in addition to a variety of other factors. And that drives everything from staffing, which is largely already, I would say, complete, to all kinds of things, including facilities operations. The ministry also provides a series of benchmarks for things like salaries and the cost of commodities or the cost of utilities, for example, and they will evolve those every year. And of course, those get factored into our calculations. And then finally, distinct from the GSN, as you may be aware, for a number of years, actually we're into probably decades now, or more than a decade, the ministry has had a set of funds outside the GSN, previously called EPOs and now called Priorities and Partnership Funding, or PPF, that's really intended to reflect specific projects that the ministry wants to undertake within school boards. So it's tightly directed funding representing specific Ministry of Education priorities that they would like to address in schools in a specific way. And they actually sort of give us those funds separately with separate agreements on in terms of how we're supposed to use those and report on them. So some of those priorities and funds have been released. So we've been able to determine what our board amounts are for some, and others the ministry has not given us the information we need to determine what our allocations are. So we'll share with you what we know tonight in that regard. Moving on to the next slide, one of the things that my team did was thought they would give you a provincial view of the scale and scope of the GSN. We know that the Upper Canada District School Board, with around a $370 million operating budget anticipated for the next year, that's an awfully big number, but when you look at it at provincial scale, it's even bigger. So In 2019-20, the province was dealing with approximately a little over 2 million students, average daily enrollment. Again, that's up slightly for 2020-21 by 0.9% to 2.04 million students average daily enrollment. With regard to the overall provincial education spend, or the GSN funding at least, in 2019-20, provincially, the GSN funding represented $24.79 billion. In 2020-21, that will be up about 3% to $25.52 billion. On a per student basis, that GSN funding represents in 1920 $12,275 per ADE, whereas in 2020-21 that is going up on average across the province to $12,525 per ADE, or an increase of 2%. So what does that look like at the board level? And that's where the next slide, slide 6, gets into GSN highlights and board level projections. So as you know, our enrollment after many years of steep decline is stabilizing, and in fact to some extent increasing a little bit. So in 2019-20, we had a hair under 26,000 students, or 25,799 students. In 2020-21, a slight increase to 25,901 average daily enrollment. We anticipate, or in 2019-20, I'm sorry, our GSN funding was $345.05 million. In 2020-21, that GSN funding creeps up by about 2% to $352.56 million. And in terms of dollars per student, $13,374 per UCDSB student average daily enrollment in 2019-20, and $13,612 per student average daily enrollment in 2020-21. You may notice that that is slightly higher than the provincial average, and that is really a reflection, I think, of the mix of students that we've got generally. So there are different in addition to enrollment, there's all kinds of different drivers of our revenue within, in addition to enrollment, and one of them is the mix of elementary and secondary students, which generate a different funding rate, and so depending on the mix of drivers in play, it can have an influence. So that would, I think, reflect that the Upper Canada District School Board has a slightly higher than average mix of secondary students. Moving on to slide 7. So some of the highlights of the GSN announcement. So as you are aware, I think if you can actually think back into the misty recesses of time before the pandemic hit, we were in the throes of collective bargaining, at least centrally, especially in the fall, and some job action. And virtually all, I think all of the centrally negotiated portions of the collective agreements have been settled. There's a 1% salary adjustment that's been applied as per the centrally negotiated collective agreements. There's a 4% benefit adjustment to reflect changes to the Employee Health and Benefit Trust funding. And as you'll be aware, you may have heard, or you would have heard through, as we settled, as the province settled the CUPE agreement centrally, and then the teachers union agreement centrally. In some of these, in virtually all the agreements, in fact, there were some supplemental funding that was came as a part of the collective agreements. And in many instances, these were called local system priorities funds. Depended on the collective agreement, the exact terminology that was used. But if you sort of bundle all of these additional funds that were associated with the settlement of the collective agreements together, the board impact for us is around $3 million. And that's generally speaking what you would find is those funds that were associated with the settlement of collective agreements are intended to reinforce staffing levels for the collective, for the bargaining units in question, and they tend to be actually, fairly stipulated in terms of how they'll be used and subject to some sort of interaction consultation with the relevant unions. A second GSN announcement highlight would be an impact resulting from class size changes. So as you'll know, with regard to OSSTF, there was a settlement that the secondary class size regulations would change to an average of 23 to 1. and that's a little higher than what our collective agreements specify, and quite a bit lower than what we were talking about at this time last year. So what you would find is that because we have slightly larger classes, then they settled on a slightly larger class size, that will have a negative impact on our board, but really almost negligible in the grand scheme of things, down $41,903. In addition, the ministry has also, in response to the expiry of some ministry software licenses, they have made sure that boards have a minimum of $30,000 per board in order to support educational software licensing, and that has flowed via formula, been moved into the GSN, into the Pupil Foundation grant, and in order to make sure we're topped up to a minimum of $30,000, there's also a supplementary amount that's delivered through the Geographic Circumstances grant and the remote and rural allocation. So that will be a plus or an add of $30,000 for the board. Moving on to slide 8. So this continues the GSN announcement highlights. So as you may recall, the GSN is composed really of 3 major components: a Pupil Foundation grant, which is a big driver, is driven largely by enrollment. There's a School Foundation grant, which really deals with school admin primarily. And the School Foundation grant, as part of that, there's, as you may be aware, there's a number of years ago, there was a revised funding model that redefined what a school is. And this was really nothing to be alarmed about, but really focused on redefining a school, especially in instances where we have 2 separate school facilities that share a contiguous boundary. So I'm thinking of South Branch and North Granville District High School, for example, where they're right next to each other. And so there was a change in the way they funded those types of facilities, and especially around admin and those kinds of things. But this is the last year of the implementation of that funding model, and it actually makes a difference for us of upward, a positive difference of $56,765. With regard to the school operations allocation, so this really refers to the funds that we receive in order to operate our school facilities. So this is my facilities portfolio. So you're really talking about utilities, cleaning, and maintenance to some extent. There's a 5-year phase-in of a new supplementary area factor, and this is part of the calculation of how they calculate how much funding we're entitled to for that operations and maintenance and renewal component of our funding. The supplementary area factor was really adjusted to reflect the fact that we have now in secondary schools slightly larger class sizes, so up to 23-to-1 on average now. From 22, I believe, and the net result of that is that according to this formula now, an individual student requires less area per student generates less funding, so that will hit us to the tune of negatively $88,769. And then school renewal, which is a significant source of capital for us. So it's how we actually do what we would consider to be major repairs and refits to schools, as distinct from maintenance. So it should be things like smaller scale things like painting and flooring. We will be receiving $768,247 this year for school renewal. Moving on to the next slide. So additional support for sick leave. So as you may be aware, one of the prevailing trends across the province has been slightly increased sick time across the broad array of employee groups we have. So benchmark funding to support sick leave has been increased, and I believe this is to reflect the data that would suggest people are taking 1 additional sick day, or our average is 1 additional sick day per year. So that would be $361,529 to the good on our board. And then in addition, as you may have heard as well, there are some funding supports that are related to COVID-19. So across the province, $10 million for mental health to support the continued well-being of students. And that is something, again, I'd like to emphasize that $10 million is province-wide. So the board amount is to be determined. Generally speaking, as you may be aware from previous conversations at the board table, our amount just prorated based on enrollment is usually somewhere between 1% and 2% of the provincial pot. So you can do the calculation there, and it's a relatively small amount. Excuse me. And then the final piece is $15 million province-wide to support additional technology-related costs. And again, the board amount is to be determined, and that's really subject to the determination in terms of how the Ministry of Education wants to apportion that among school boards. Moving on to the next slide, one of the things we just like to highlight with GSNs is oftentimes things will move around from year to year. So things, terms that you get used to hearing for a number of years start changing year over year. So as I mentioned earlier, the GSN is really composed of grants in three major categories. There's the Pupil Foundation Grant, which is driven largely by our enrollments. There's the School Foundation Grant, which is things that are sort of apportioned on a school-by-school basis, such as school administration. And then there's another class of grants, a large number of grants that used to be called special purpose grants, and those are now called supplemental grants. So really what you're seeing largely there is a name change and not a reflection of anything new or lost. In previous years, you would have heard under the Learning Opportunities Grant, which happens to be a special purpose or now supplemental grant, there used to be a library staffing amount, and that has been now realigned. So the actual library staffing amount that was formerly under the Learning Opportunities Grant has come out of the Learning Opportunities Grant and is now part of the School Foundation Grant. So not a huge change in number, but really just a move. One thing that represents a larger number, but again is not a real net change to the organization, is what is referred to, used to be referred to as the program leadership allocation, and that used to come under the board's administration and governance allocation. That has now been moved into a new grant category altogether, so it's under the supplemental grants, and this is really, previous years and currently really refers to believe it's six specific types of program leaders in the organization. So you have heard that we have, early years lead, Indigenous ed lead, and so on, and they would have been funded out of this fund used to be under the administration and governance grant. It's now its own grant, and I think that's more to reflect. I think that the ministry, as I read, some of the intention was wanting to reflect that this is really about program leadership and not as much about sort of general administration. So no huge change, just really a refocusing. Safe and Accepting Schools allocation was a grant in 2019-20. That has been renamed to the Mental Health and Well-Being Grant. And part of the reason for that, as I understand, is there's been another grant that's kind of moved under that umbrella, which it relates to mental health staffing. And I think I'll be touching on that a little bit later. And then finally, as I mentioned earlier, the Support for Students Fund, which is something entirely new under the supplemental grants. But that is really a $3 million catch-all that represents those local systems priorities type funds that were negotiated as part of collective agreements, and because our local collective bargaining process is still ongoing, those are in various stages of being rolled out. So moving on to the next slide, I'm just catching up on my notes. So the GSN we've talked briefly about the three major components of the GSN, the Pupil Foundation Grant, number one. Number two is the School Foundation Grant. And number three are the special purpose grants, now renamed as the supplemental grants. The other part of our funding that exists outside of the GSN is, as I mentioned earlier, priorities and partnership funding. And so these tend to be reflective of individual projects and priorities that the Ministry of Education has undertaken and don't want to necessarily fold into the GSN, but want to provide us in a very directed way funding and also the direction on how to deploy and report on the use of that funding. So the Ministry of Education this year has announced over $300 million in priorities and partnership funding for 2020-21. Of that $300 million, only about $117 million has been earmarked to support specific ministry priorities. So $67 million of that $117 million has been allocated by program with specific school board allocations. So there's this $300 million that's out there. The ministry has committed $117 million of it to specific priorities. And of that $117 million, we can that the $67 million they've drilled down to identify what boards are getting specifically. So $15 million, and I'm sorry, I think they basically said specific school board allocations, and then $50 million of that will be allocated by program with individual school board allocations yet to be determined. So of that $117 million, we know what priorities, how that's going to be divided up among their priorities, but of the $117 million, we don't know $50 million what our share is of that $50 million. And then I think one other change is that you'll see happening in the spirit of the realignment and renaming is from time to time, these PPFs which exist outside the GSN will sometimes get folded into the GSN. And so 5 existing PPFs have been, from 1920, have been folded into the GSN for 2020-21, but only 4 are really applicable to the UCDSB, and that's just by nature of their definition. So moving on to the next slide, a little bit more detail on what those 5 areas are, or those ones that have been transferred into the GSN. So there used to be a PPF called Northern Supports Initiative, and that has moved into the special education allocation. And that one, by coincidence, is one that obviously is not applicable to us. The Curriculum and Assessment PPF from 1920 has been folded into the Administration and Governance allocation. The Executive Compensation PPF, which was intended from 1718 to fund the implementation of executive compensation frameworks under the previous government and was funded as a PPF, has now been folded into the Administration and Governance allocation. The Experiential Learning PPF has now been folded into the Learning Opportunities Grant as an enveloped allocation. And mental health workers, as I mentioned a minute ago, that was a PPF that has been folded into the Mental Health and Wellbeing Grant, which used to be called Safe and Accepting Schools. So just to give you a little sense of what that means is that the PPFs, that those 4 that impact the Upper Canada District School Board represent a total of about $800,000 totally that we would have had more or less last year, and we're going to continue to have this year. They're just moving into the GSN. Moving on to the next slide. One of the things we wanted to show you were that as I mentioned, about $67 million of the $117 million in PPF funding that the ministry has announced already in terms of their priorities, we can actually say what our board share is of the amounts that they've announced. So we know what our board share is of the math PPF. It's approximately almost $1 million. With regard to the special education PPF, much smaller, about $86,000 or $0.0857 million. In terms of the mental health and well-being PPF, just about $0.05 million, and engaging parents and communities, $0.016 million, or about $16,000. With regard to the remaining PPFs, student pathways, supporting student potential, system support and efficiencies, and Indigenous education, the ministry has not yet provided us with calculations as to what our share of that will be. So we're still awaiting to see how that will pan out. So really the total that we can say that we have announced is $1.14 million in PPFs, with the remainder to be determined. Moving on to the next slide. As you know, referring back to one of my earlier slides where we were talking about the budget process priorities, one of our major priorities is to make sure that we submit a compliant budget for the upcoming fiscal year. So you've seen this slide or something like it since April 22nd, as we brought you a series of iterations in greater and greater levels of refinement, starting with our general budget outlook, which was a bit of a crystal ball look. Subsequently, we brought our expense budget, and now we're bringing you a level closer to what we think is going to be where we land on our final budget. So as it stands right now, our preliminary calculations, and again, this is not a budget, it's really just to give you a flavor for how things are evolving. Our in-year revenues for compliance purposes for 2020-21, we're forecasting to be $376,596,675. Our in-year expenses for compliance purposes, we're forecasting to be $376,371,815, and that would yield an anticipated in-year surplus for compliance purposes of approximately $224,000. As you know, our compliance threshold of 1% would say that we need to pass a budget that does not provide a deficit any greater than $3.4 million. And obviously, with a projected surplus of $224,000, we're well within the compliant threshold, and therefore we continue to anticipate we'll have a fully compliant budget. One of the things that people may be asking about, given that we've seen some evolution in this slide, again, I would say that, as more information becomes known, we get a more and more precise level of revenue estimate and expense estimate. So people may be thinking about why have our expenses changed from what we saw on April 22nd? Why has our revenue changed from what we saw on April 22nd? So what you would see compared to actually the May 27th expense budget presentation, we're showing expenses that are up by about $1.4 million from our previous estimate of $375 million. And again, lots has changed since May 27th, including our refinement. So in our May 27th estimate, we didn't include any expenses related to PPFs. So the PPFs that we are now seeing, that, as you saw on the previous slide, $1.1 million in PPFs that even though in some cases we don't 100% know where every last dollar is going to go at this stage because we're still in the planning stage, we do know that we will spend all of it, and so that $1.1 million is reflected in our expenses. We also know that we've actually done some work to bolster our distance learning team in anticipation of a September startup where almost 100% certainly we're going to have greater dependence on technology and distance education in some measure. So there's a $400,000 expense related to supporting that, and a little bit less, $100,000 less expenses related to revised amounts for amortization, interest, and salary benefits due to some of the updated assumptions. So the surplus decrease of $500,000, as you'll recall, back on April 22nd, we presented a rough crystal ball estimate of a $700,000 surplus. Why is it decreased by $500,000 since then? That's largely due to a little bit less than expected Indigenous education funding due to fewer than anticipated credits for 2020-21. So that's $400,000. And a little bit less anticipated funding in FSL due to a reduced number of elementary students enrolled in FSL and slightly fewer FSL credits anticipated to be taken by secondary students. So from a finance standpoint, I think we would be quite comfortable in saying that even though the anticipated surplus is different from what we anticipated or we forecasted on April 22nd, given that on April 22nd we knew almost nothing about our revenue stance for 2020-21 and a little bit better about our expense stance, but still there are lots of unknowns. We feel like we're well within the margin of error there and are comfortable with this anticipated direction. So moving on to the next slide, again, potential opportunities for 2020-21 budget flexibility. referring back to my earlier slide about the priorities for this year's budget process, one of the priorities was, as this situation with regard to the pandemic continues to evolve, we don't know what we're going to be dealing with in September. We don't know what we're going to be dealing with in October, November, or thereabouts. So one of the strategies we are trying to employ is to provide trustees some sense that they will have an opportunity to allocate financial resources leading up to September or even after September in response to the evolution of the pandemic, or in response to the trustee priorities that have been already stated or that continue to emerge. And those would be, supporting the accumulated surplus, elementary health and well-being specialists, as we discussed, transportation consortium contingency, and expansion of PUP and Spec Ed. So, really what we're seeing here, I think, there are some opportunities for us to have funds set aside that are not a contingency reserve, but really not allocated in a specific way. So the sources of these potential opportunities largely would be those PPFs. So as you know, not only the PPFs are just rolling in and the numbers are just rolling in, and in fact, there's some numbers that haven't even rolled in yet. So that represents an opportunity. We know that through the work of Superintendent Ferguson, his team, and subsequently Superintendent Perry in Spec Ed, we are still waiting to hear what the results of our special incidents portion applications will be, knowing that we've applied for $3.2 million in funding, and yet we've only budgeted for $750,000 in revenue. So the difference there could make a significant impact, and we anticipate in the coming months to get a better sense of what that will be. Did we know that in terms of rural and northern education funds, we deferred the revenue, as I mentioned in a previous presentation, I believe in 1920, amounting to $1.4 million. And that means that that amount of money will be accessible to us, barring any additional spending or commitments against that in the 2021 school year, plus any additional RNEF funding for 2021 that is not already committed. And there may be a few sources of other deferred revenue that would be sort of much more minor in comparison. But we feel the range of further funding opportunities could be between about $900,000 and $4.8 million that would be available leading up to the start of fiscal 2020-21, which would be September 1st, or through the year as these opportunities evolve. And those are some of those expenditures that trustees may wish to direct towards the actual pandemic response, or again, and or to trustees' stated trustee priorities, or new ones should they emerge. So this is how we would see a strategy for going into the next fiscal year, giving the trustees some teeth in terms of how they want to respond to the circumstances as they evolve, without being forced to actually commit right now to something that may be out of alignment with the actual situation that we encounter in the new school year. And finally, in summary, first of all, we're really, I think, happy to see, after a little bit of uncertainty last year, to say at the least, is that the 2021 GSN remains largely unchanged from 1920. So, we've had quite a few slides as to the changes, but by and large, what we're seeing is funding is very stable. Funding is there are some opportunities for us to make investments in areas of priority. Preliminary revenue and expense projections show a modest surplus, and we also have unallocated amounts on top of that we anticipate we could be using for COVID-related expenses or trustee priorities that we outlined on the previous slide. And we'll be ready to present a full budget to you, revenue and expense in detail, on July 15th, 2020 for your consideration. And that is the end of my presentation, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Superintendent Hobbs. That was very, very well done. Trustees, I'm opening the floor to you. Are there any questions?
Mr. Chair.
Go ahead, Trustee McDonald.
Thank you. I want to echo your comments. It was very well done, very well laid out, giving us some perspective on the changes to the revenue side of things, especially. I like the approach that we'd be looking at. I think it's important for us to make sure that we have some flexibility as we move forward into addressing what September will look like. And one of the things that I do want to make sure that we address is as we, I think it was on slide 10 or slide 11, we have the 4 quadrants and, oh, sorry, no, it's 14, I think. 15. I'll get there. It's like playing Price is Right. I think what we want to be careful of is that we make sure that we have the plans in place that allow us to be scalable should funding come in or should the triggers be released. Because if this funding comes through, as we build the budget, we want to be able to have things that can scale up quickly and meet the needs of kids. The last thing I want to be able to or have to do is be looking at unspent revenue in a given year and having those discussions again leading into second and third quarter. So I'm hoping that when we do build the budget for final review and as we plan for the year, that we have those plans in place, those scalable features that allow us to act quickly should those funds come through and should additional funds come through and either roll out in addition to what we've already put in place or ensure that the funds that we do have allocated for those specific projects that we might have, if they get funded through the priorities or through the new opportunities that we would have, then let's go back and look at other plans that we might be able to address to help students as well. It's important for us to make sure that we build our surplus, but we also want to make sure that we are using the funds within the given year and making sure that we're helping kids. So I'm hoping that we get some insight into that as we move forward. And it doesn't necessarily need to be all part of our original budget approval, but I think it needs to be built into what we would potentially be looking at in the fall.
Thank you, Trustee McDonald. Good comments. Are there other comments? I just wanted to say, if I could, just to follow up on Trustee McDonald's comments, is that I was on a conference call this afternoon with the minister and all the other board chairs in the province. And I'm not going to get into the operational side about school re-entry or reopening. However, there are a lot of unknowns. For example, the minister announced the de-streaming of grade 9, with which I agree totally. And yet, this announcement was made after the GSNs. So my point to the minister was, in my email to him, was that there's a great deal of professional development that needs to go on in order to make this really successful. So, to your point, Trustee McDonald, there are many unknowns yet, and I'm hoping that we will be, compensated accordingly. Any other questions, comments? Seeing none, I believe we are at the adjournment. And I have a motion moved by Trustee McCray, seconded by Trustee Parisien, that the Upper Canada District School Board adjourn at 7:49 p.m. Am I correct? Everybody okay? You want to vote on that? I'm trying to find it. I'm voting in favor of adjournment.
In favor.
In favor.
Lisa, does that pass? I'm assuming it does. So trustees, I just want you to stay cool and have some rest, and we'll see you next Wednesday. I'll see you next Wednesday, okay? Bye now.
Bye, John.
Night all.